Welcome to the webinar on implementing UDL in a rural middle school. We call it Becoming Oodlers because that was actually the name we came up with in the group that was doing this implementation. My name is Linda Daly, and I am an AT specialist with the Special Education Technology Center. And with me is Cindy Cornelia, and I'll let you introduce yourself.
Hi, as Linda said, I'm Cindy Cornelia, and I am an assistant professor at Whitworth University, and I just served as a support person in working with the middle school and doing a book study and some implementation of UDL with the staff.
So, and it says our third presenter is Danielle Boyd, and she is not with us. We're hoping she will be able to join us. I left her at the top because she really was the driving force behind this. So, and we'll get into that a little bit more, how we came together as we get into the webinar. And so we are just going to look at today describing some typical questions, motivations, and barriers that teachers in a rural school district face when starting UDL. And I will tell you that I think these were not just for a rural school district. I really felt like that they applied to any school district. So we didn't know if there'd be some that were specific to rural, but I really felt like what we found would have been very similar across the board. We're also going to identify some ways to encourage and motivate teachers to continue with the UDL implementation that we found we were doing, and then also ways to overcome barriers when implementing UDL. First, I just want to show you where this school district is. So this was Freeman Middle School in Rockford, Washington, which is just south of Spokane Valley and southeast of Spokane in the very eastern part of Washington State. So you can see it's surrounded by wheat fields. It is rural. It has just under 1,000 students. I looked up on our state's OSPI webpage, and it said that there are 904 students in the entire school district. So that is where we were, and we were working with a team of middle school students. So when we started this project, I'm just going to start at the beginning, which we'll make these two slides in a little bit of a different order, maybe. Maybe I'll start with this slide first, because this tells how the team came together and the idea came together. This was the support team, and Danny, Cindy, the special ed director, Kristen Leslie, and I were all at a conference together, and it was a UDL conference, and Kristen and I were talking about the fact that we would like to see this implemented in a school. We would like to support a school that was really implementing it, trying to start it. Cindy, I'm going to let you tell what your background was. So,
well, my background is with regard to the project, Linda.
Yes, like what your background and how come you know, that discussion we had, what your background was.
Okay, so my background coming to it was simply that I do teach courses and have my training in special education, but I've largely spent my time in regular education classrooms and supporting students who receive Tier 2 and Tier 3 services, and working with schools on implementation of multi-tiered systems of support. And one of the challenges that schools seem to face broadly is really providing quality instruction to all students in Tier 1, meaning access to general education curriculum. And so that's an area that I actually have expertise in and like to spend my time, is helping students and teachers be successful with instruction and then, of course, access to core curriculum in the regular classroom. And as I've learned more and more about universal design for learning, that is a place where we can start. It's not the only answer, but it's just such a key starting point in designing instruction from the front end so that the majority, if not all, students can access instruction at a level that's appropriate for them. And so, so I'm just very interested in becoming very, very well versed in universal design because I think it will help me help teachers better as I continue to serve them.
So as Kristen and I sat at a table with Cindy and met her, she was the only person we knew in Washington State who'd actually done some teaching with UDL. She had done it at the university level, correct?
Oh, thank you. Yes, I didn't mention that. Yes. Yes, I should probably expand on that. So when I was, one of the things that I have spent quite a bit of time doing is applying universal design in my own classroom at the university. And I teach teacher candidates. So really working hard to set that model, but also to make sure that my instruction is accessible for all of my students, because I do have students coming from very diverse, just students with a lot of diversity. And so UDL fits very, very well in higher education as well.
So as we were talking, and then Chris and I were talking about, we would love to support somebody who wants to try this, because as a special education technology center, we're a support, but we can't actually implement it. And Danny happened to be at the table and she said, can I be your first school to do that? So we were so excited that she was so excited. She was doing her principal internship that year and she wanted to see if she could bring it to her Freeman Middle School. So we said, we would love to support you. So that's why Danny is really the person who was the driving force, but then Cindy, Kristen, and I were the support team around them. And when Danny first started this, she thought, I might just take a few teachers that I think would be receptive to this and see if they would be willing to trial this. She went to her principal, he was behind it, and in our very first meeting, it was decided that she would not handpick the teachers. She would present it to the entire staff of the middle school, give just a brief kind of an introduction to UDL, and then see who wanted to try this. And correct me if I'm wrong, Cindy, but I think every teacher joined. Wasn't that the case?
Yeah, at the middle school, yes.
Yes. So that every one of them was on board. Now, some of them came with more trepidation than others, but they were all willing to try this and they were all in. So it was amazing. The team was so fun to work with. They weren't afraid to ask hard questions. They weren't afraid to tell us things they were struggling with, and they weren't afraid to just go forward and try it with their students. So it was a really fun year to do this. And so we had each one of them, and what we decided, and we decided it as a team, how we would do this. So to do this, what we did was collaborated and supported each other in bi-weekly meetings. So they actually volunteered to come early to school and do meetings twice a month. And so we all came together. We decided to do a book study on Katie Novak's UDL Now. And at the end of the presentation, we have a link to that so that you can get that. It's a book. It's also got great resources online for it. Oh, thank you. Thank you, Cindy. That's great. So, and just in case anybody's wondering about this, the school was willing, I think, to purchase some, but SETC also purchased some and we loaned them to them. So it doesn't have to be a cost outlay. We didn't want it to be we didn't want the cost of the book to be a barrier. So some people had their own, some were provided by SETC, and I think some were provided by the school. And so that was kind of the study we were looking at. So we were doing the book study with it, and we were just learning the UDL principles through exploration and trying them out. And then we were recognizing the challenges and problem solving along the way. One of the things I want to mention is when we started the process, before we went to the teachers, thought, okay, let's just look at one piece of UDL. Let's look at making text accessible and reducing the barriers to text. And then, so that was in our mind, that was in Danny's mind and my mind, and tech was part of my background. So obviously that I was going to be there to support that. And then Cindy was on board with that too. So we'll see as we move forward what actually happened with that. So when we started, the teachers had some questions. They actually had quite a few, but we just wanted to talk about their initial questions, their motivations, and then their perceived barriers. And we actually did questionnaires with them to find out what these questions would be. So some of the first questions, and Cindy, feel free to expand on this as I'm going along. You can just jump in, so anytime. So one of the questions was, how much work will it be for me? And we've heard that a lot. When people think about UDL, they think about they're having to design things for every individual student. It just sounds like a ton of work. So how much work will it be for me? Does it align to the standards? Because the standards are important. And so if we're given all these different choices of work, how's that going to align to the standards? What does classroom management look like? And then basically, how do we do it? So those were some of their questions. But some of their motivations were, I'm always looking for better ways to engage and reach students, all students. And I like to learn and try new strategies, and I want to grow as a teacher. So I think the motivations speak pretty highly to how great these teachers are. So, they were motivated because they wanted to do the best for their students and be the best student teachers they could be. So, and then some of the perceived barriers that they had were time. There's just not enough time to do this. And making gains without creating gaps in learning. So that was a big question in the beginning. How are we going to do this and not leave out pieces that we really need to be teaching and students need to be learning? And then how do I implement UDL and still teach everything students should know? And scaffolding, how are we going to do that scaffolding? So those were kind of their questions, their motivations, and their barriers.
And I'll comment a little bit on that perceived barrier when they were talking about making gains without creating gaps, and then implementing UDL and teaching everything students should know. Just as we get towards the end and we share what teachers learned in the end, there will be a little bit of information provided with what they learned along the way. But that particular question really was around assessments, state assessments, and if I'm offering choice, which is a large part of UDL, and if I'm making things accessible, am I still giving students what they need to be able to be successful on those assessments? And so a lot of their motivation behind that barrier was linked to a state assessment and not understanding UDL. This was prior to them really digging into the book. So it's just interesting to watch how this particular piece unfolds in our journey.
Right. And actually, that's a good segue into some of our discussion on how it did go into as our journey went. Because one of the things that we wanted to assure them, but until people were doing it, you couldn't really assure them. But UDL is it's a framework for how you teach. And your students are learning in such a way that they're learning to be learners. So they're still learning their information. And actually, that helps them when they go to be assessed because they've learned it better, so they can show that knowledge more on a test than if they've just learned it as rote repetition or memorization. So they've learned it in so many different ways, and they've learned it in ways that were personal to them. And so it really did stick with them. And as we start, at this point, I don't have a slide for this. I was just going to have some interaction back and forth between Cindy and if Danny comes, of the three of us, to just kind of talk about how the year went. I thought it was interesting. As we joined, everybody was excited, but I would say there was hesitation too. Mm-hmm. And because this was a lot we were asking them to do, and it was new, and it was interesting. We went through a chapter a month. I think we ended up doing a chapter a month, not a chapter a week. I think in the end, we did a chapter a month, and it was funny because it seemed like it went through a flow in the beginning, probably the first half of the year, where we're learning about it, we're kind of excited, and then we'd come back and we're frustrated. There would be frustration. And so we'd kind of work through those things. And then the next week they'd come back and they'd be like, okay, we're trying it. And we'd go on to a little bit more. And then the next week it was like, okay, there's a little frustration. But then about the third month, there was success. And it was all of a sudden that like, whoa, you should see what my students did and you should see how they ran with it. And so then we probably had a couple more meetings where it was more like, let's see what more we can do. And then there was some more frustration. And then by the end of it, I think the frustration wasn't as much there and there was just more excitement. Would you say that was kind of how it went, Cindy?
Yeah, and my impression is, again, it was, well, like when we read chapter 1, I remember having conversation that I believe we had wished chapter 2 was presented before chapter 1.
Right.
Because a lot of their questions that first month really weren't answered in the first chapter,
Right.
but they started to be answered in the second chapter and then subsequent chapters. And so a lot of what we were seeing in the beginning was lack of understanding. They were like learning just enough to really start to begin to think differently, but not really know how to be able to put it into action. And some of what they were learning too is there's so much to UDL, and feeling like, wow, even though we started with literacy and making text accessible, as they were learning about, you know, all the different things that make UDL what UDL can be for students, I think they were recognizing that they wanted to be able to do it all and do it all well and do it all right. And so a lot of it was kind of talking them down a little bit off of those expectations and realizing that it might be a better way to approach it might be, let's look at all the things that we're doing and how can we do them even better. And when they started to make those shifts, I mean, it was both encouraging them to have that focus, but them also learning more. They started to recognize a lot of the things they were already doing and how they could make it better for students and how they could make UDL integrate with things that they already do in their classrooms, but just tweak it so that it helps students access it better and access it in a way that works personally for each student. I really think those pieces are what shaped some of their comfort level and feeling of success over time.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So the book was a great resource. I feel like that was a great resource, but it was great to be able to have the group effort and really talk about it. And they were trying it, they were using the book, but they had each other to, you know, really bounce ideas off of and really share their successes, their frustrations, their questions. It was a really, I feel like it was a really good format, didn't you?
I did. Yeah. It was really informal, which honestly, from my standpoint in the beginning, I was like, okay, how can this be, you know, research and how can we get data, and, you know, putting on my little hat. It was actually very informal. It was wonderful. Actually, it was just very informal and yet so meaningful. It was, it just really unfolded in a way that I think was good for all of us. From a learning standpoint, and then from a teacher standpoint, and then impacting student standpoint.
Right. Yeah. And like Cindy said, that really the accessible text was a small part of it. They actually went so much further than that, and really giving students that choice and how they can do different expression and how they can you know, how they represented things to students. So they really found that that was a minor part of it. And so what we thought too small initially. And then, yeah, so this would be a good time to just give you some of their feedback as they were coming toward the end of the year. And so this was probably about 7 months in, wasn't it? Yeah. Probably about 7 months in. I thought it would be chaos, but instead the students were just really engaged. And UDL doesn't seem to consider students' weaknesses, and it assumes a certain level of maturity in students. Mm-hmm. And that was that UDL does say all students are learners, and we're going to make that assumption that all students are learners. So, and then I was afraid the students would be all over the place, but even the kids who typically struggle with behaviors were on task. And students are moving more and thinking more for themselves. So One thing I do want to say here, so those were some of the thoughts the teachers had, some of their insights. One of the things that happened early on that I think really got everybody excited was one of the staff members had told a story about a student, one of their students who, it's a small school, so everybody knows all the students. And this was one of those students that they were having, my understanding of it is they had trouble getting the student motivated and the student didn't really want to participate much. But he stayed, I'm saying he, I don't actually know if it's a he or she. So forgive me, but I'm just gonna say he. He stayed after school, and the staff, it was in that staff member's room, and just said, can I use the whiteboard while I'm waiting for my mom? And the staff member said, that's fine, as long as you erase it when you're done. They had been doing a study on the book Holes, and the student really had not seemed to be engaged, had not really been doing much of the work. And when, after about 20 minutes, the teacher looked up and actually was amazed at what was on the whiteboard. It was the entire book of Holes in a drawing, like a comic book type drawing. The themes were there, the the main character, the setting, it was all there. It was an analysis of themes in a picture, in a drawing. And unfortunately, they had told him to erase it when he was done, and he remembered that. And they were so sorry that they did not get a picture of it. But it was such a beautiful depiction of why UDL is important and why we need to give students their own way to express things. And I think that story alone really encouraged everybody to keep going. Don't you think, Cindy, that was one of them?
It did. And I also wanted to comment that these comments that are on this particular slide are one of the things that teachers were really working with were assessing students in different ways, and along with that, giving students to meet. They were wrestling a lot with, how do I hold everybody to the same standard? Like, how does everybody achieve the standard if they can go about it in different ways? That was like a real hard thing for them to wrap their brains around. And we had a lot of conversation around, is it possible to have one grading rubric, yet have students come to it from different ways? So an example would be the student drawing on the board. Could he actually demonstrate that in the same way that another student could, through a different medium, but still meet the standards? Mm-hmm. And once they started to, we probably spent, I don't know, that came up probably at least 3 different meetings. It was the main topic of conversation. Yes. But these comments are reflective of some of that learning. I thought it would be chaos. It doesn't consider their weaknesses. It assumes maturity. All of those are around what they saw their students were capable of when they knew what the standard was, and they knew they had a voice, and in how to go about meeting that standard. This is what happened. The students were more on task. They were more engaged. They demonstrated standards better than they had before. They were being creative and thinking about what are my strengths as a student, and how can I show my teacher what I know. So those were all the kinds of things that were coming through, and that's kind of what's reflected here in this comment, or in these comments. But your story is a perfect example of that, because there's lots of different projects that students were doing in relation to particular standards.
So because it's student work, it's hard to show you that, because, we need to, but we could talk about some of the things. One of the teachers was doing was the Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, and talked about that she pretty much gave them open choices. I think she gave them suggestions, but then also opened it to them. And one group came up with an amazingly elaborate game, complete with cards for characters, and then another group did a Candyland game to style game to do that. Do you remember some of the other things they did?
A student wrote a book where she illustrated and rewrote the story. A comic book.
In another class, they did a play.
Yes.
Mm-hmm. And I remember the teachers talking about the fact that they thought, oh no, these projects are too big. We need to actually scale the kids back. And then they didn't. And those kids performed. I mean, I don't mean just performed with a play. I mean, they actually accomplished their projects.
They did. And I don't know is there a slide in here on the students' comments?
I don't think so, because we weren't sure we could put the student comments in a public.
Okay. So, so informally, I sat in on some questions that a particular teacher asked her students, and some of the things that the students had shared in response to that was, next time I might I might really think about how big that project is, because it really was too big for some students, but yet other students were like, I liked how I did that, but next time I do it this way. So it was pretty fun to be able to sit in and just listen on students reflect on this new way of doing things and what they were learning about themselves and what they were learning about how to go about large projects. And anyway, it was just such great student reflection on learning that that wasn't an anticipated outcome that I thought I would see. So it was good.
Yeah, we had lots of great outcomes that we were surprised at. So that it was fun that way too. So I'm going to just briefly, I'll just show a brief slide of kind of a collage of student work, and then I'm going to move past it just because we are recording this, and I don't want to, I just want to respect the students' privacy, but you'll be able to see some of the student work just briefly. So you can just see that there's comic books and games and amazing drawings, and those students who did have that talent in drawing were able to use that and let that be an expression. So, and then students who were more about designing games, they got to use that. So it was just fun to see the kids be able to come through that. So, use that and come through, the skills come through. So, so we did want to talk about some of the successes and some of the structures that we found in the implementation. And again, I'll read them, and then Cindy, please fill in, okay? So students are more excited, and I think it's gotten me out of my rut. So this is the successes. I see students more engaged and having more fun with their learning. Students reveal abilities that we would never realize with traditional means of teaching and learning. Students make stronger connections to learning. Many students go far beyond what I would expect. Students are developing a deeper understanding of the lessons taught. So, and then the struggles was the mindset. It can be difficult to break away from traditional methods. And time is the biggest barrier in implementing any new strategy. And it's hard to install on the fly. So those were some of the struggles they had. So I don't know if you want to add anything, or it's kind of self-explanatory. So
a little bit, yeah. And a little, it just validates some of the things we were saying on the previous slide about the responses that they were seeing in students. And I was excited about that first one, the successes. It's gotten me out of my rut. I mean, that was one of the most rewarding things to see in watching the teachers' response to this journey. Is they were very open and but like you said, a little hesitant in the beginning, and how much work is this going to be? And over time, I think that they realized how much work it really was going to be, but their enthusiasm towards it was different. They were leaning into it instead of kind of leaning back from it,
Right.
And realizing that they can choose when to back in and when to kind of back off. But just the enthusiasm in the teachers and the I can't think of the word that I'm trying to say, but it just renewed their passion for teaching kids. And and I think they really, really were validated by it. I mean, I think they felt like they were making a difference. You know what I mean? Doing something important. And that's just me qualitatively just looking in. But it just was really fun to watch the teachers just light up as they went through this journey and be passionate about what they're doing.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. I would agree with all of that you said.
Mm-hmm.
So, and then we did want to talk about overcoming barriers of implementing it in a rural school. And like I said, I don't really think these are specific to a rural school. I think these are just specific to probably most organizations, but we're talking about schools, so specifically to schools. So one of their barriers was time. And why was that a barrier? Because their schedule actually did not allow any collaboration time. So these teachers actually volunteered for these 40-minute biweekly meetings. So that was a big commitment on their part, because that wasn't in the schedule. So they were willing to do this on their own time. So that was how they overcame that barrier. And then culture. Why? Because traditional community and traditional classrooms, this school does have, it's a very traditional community, and that's just the way it works. And the classrooms have been set up very traditionally. That's what their parents are used to. That's what the staff is used to. So that could have been a barrier, but they overcame it by being willing to break out of their box and move past their hesitation and just really try it. And I just cannot give enough kudos to those teachers for how they did that. I just think they were fabulous. So, and then technology, because technology can be one of the ways we reduce the barriers. And they had older computers in 2 labs, and then they had 2 computers on wheels for 10 classrooms. So this district does not have a one-to-one at that time. And so when you hear that, oh, you have to have technology for UDL, I would say technology in the end factored very little into this. Wouldn't you say, Cindy?
I would. And it's going back to the beginning, that's where we started. Do you remember? Because we were that was part of how are we going to help text be more accessible to students. And let's really hit this from the technology piece. And a lot of that is, Spokane Education Technology Center.
Right.
And, so, I mean, that's really kind of where the mindset was in the beginning, and that's not where it ended up. And I think that's, and it's funny because now that district is moving forward in technology, so they'll be able to bring to it better. But it's just kind of funny how it came full circle like that.
Yeah. So, and I do just have to correct, it's the Special Education Technology Centers, just so they know that there's not really a Spokane one.
Oh, did I say Spokane? Oh,
yeah.
I'm sorry.
So, yeah. But just so you don't think,
I'm sorry.
No, that's okay. So, but I do want to address the technology too, just because we did think we were going to go that way. Mm-hmm. So from the beginning, we got IT involved. And in the very beginning, I came and met with the IT person from Freeman, and Danny joined us, and he was very receptive to it, and very, he was willing to be very helpful with us. So, and then they were doing a Chrome rollout scheduled for the next year. So that was what was going to be nice, is they had set the stage, and so they were ready to then, when those Chromebooks came, they already had that mindset of, okay, now this is one more way we can let the kids choose what works best for them. So, and
I actually like that it happened that way, Linda. I really do, because I think sometimes, in fact, there's a book I'm familiar with, and one of the chapters really presents, if you only read that chapter in this book, you'd walk away thinking UDL is about technology and using technology to make instruction accessible to kids. And that's not true at all. It is a big part of it, but it is certainly not even close to all of it. There's so many other pieces to UDL. And I don't know that, I just don't know that the teachers would have dug into that had the technology been available like we had originally hoped.
Right. And I think that all of us who were supporting it felt that same way, because we did talk about it, and we were like, oh, this went a different way, but we're really glad it did.
Yeah.
So,
yeah.
And that's not to say if you're going to try to do it in your district that technology might not be a bigger piece. I guess what we're trying to say is let some of it grow naturally. See how it happens. So
and recognize that that's not all of it. There's many other ways to make instruction accessible to kids.
Exactly. So so then as we were looking at this, and again, 7 months in, new thoughts and lingering, and I actually cannot see my screen. Lingering questions. You can see my screen, but I can't. So, okay. So what has changed? And now I think, are you seeing pictures on the bottom of your screen, or are you seeing the closed captioning?
I see closed captioning.
Okay, perfect. Okay. My screen is a little different, so I needed to verify that. So,
Okay.
So what changed? So with the teachers, this was the teachers, correct, Cindy? These were questions to the teachers. So now including more choice in lessons, offering to all what used to be offered to some, free to think outside the box, and trying more strategies, allowing students to be involved in their own learning. So I'm going to stop with that and just see if you have anything to add to that, and I'll do each column. So,
okay. One of the things in the very, 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 very beginning, early conversations, even before we met with teachers, there was conversation around students on IEPs being able to access. And I guess I'm looking at that second bullet, offering to all what used to be offered to some. And I think that is probably the largest reason for my passion behind UDL is it may start with how can we make instruction accessible for our students who might not otherwise be successful in our classrooms. But what's learned over time is the things that we're doing for students to, for example, students on IEPs that really are not able to access general education instruction without modifications. When we make some accommodations for them, we start to see that those same accommodations are very beneficial for other students in our classroom. And so that's really, that number 2 is my favorite part, is offering to all what used to be offered to some, and seeing that there's some students who benefit and we didn't even realize that they needed some kind of different way to access instruction. I don't, technically, I guess you could call it accommodations, but it's just different ways to access instruction and how it allows students to blossom. So anyway, I just like that it changed the mindset, and that conversation just became about students. It didn't become about a student who, you know, is on an IEP, or a student who speaks English as a second language. It just became about our students. And I just think that's really powerful.
Yeah. Thanks. So, and then for the teachers, the benefits of UDL they saw were students are more excited and more engaged. Students go far beyond expectations and choose appropriate levels for themselves. And students are better able to authentically connect with material for deeper meaning. And those were just powerful statements to me for what, and this is what these teachers saw evidence in their students. It wasn't high in the sky, this is what we think. This is what they actually observed.
Yeah.
So, do you have anything to add to that?
No, probably just piggybacking on what I already said. The students being excited about learning was a huge motivator for teachers because they were seeing disengagement for a variety of reasons. So that was just a real powerful finding or result of all of this. And then that second one, students going far beyond expectations. I mean, that's the power of it. When you give students different ways to access and you help them be also in charge of their learning right alongside you, and you help them to find ways that work well for them, that is a finding. We see that they will go further. They'll show us more than we thought that they had. They kind of take the lid off of our expectations for them.
Right.
Yeah.
So
that's good.
Yeah. So, and lingering questions they still had. How do we find more time to collaborate and develop more ideas? So they wanted to take it further. What does assessment look like? So there was still a question on, what does assessment look like? And to what level can I take UDL? So, and the only thing I want to say about specifically when you look at what does assessment look like, and it's not necessarily about assessment, but I think it's about implementing UDL. It's not going to all be implemented in 1 year. It's a process, and you're growing. And they did so much in that first year, but each year you're going to do more and more. It's going to take time before you really are doing full UDL. And that was one of the things we told them: give yourself time, give yourself grace. Don't expect it all in 1 year.
Mm-hmm.
So, do you have anything to add to that?
No, other than, I don't know if you would ever, implementing UDL is really shifting your mindset, and also being, having an understanding that it never looks the same, because if you're really implementing universal design, it's going to shift as your students shift, whether that's, day to day or year to year. So anyway, there's not one way to say, okay, now I'm doing UDL.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. So, and that is mainly what we had to present. So we wanted to just kind of share that journey we were on. We wanted to give you some resources too. Each one of us are willing to, you can contact us. We can answer any questions. The Special Education Technology Center is willing to help you and your district if you want to proceed on this journey. We do have the link for Katie Novak's, both her book name and then also her webpage link, because she has some great resources on her webpage too. So if anybody has any questions now for us, feel free to unmute yourself and you can ask questions directly. You can ask them in the chat, whatever works best for you. So I did mute somebody because there was some background noise coming in. But if you can't unmute yourself, just go ahead and put it in the chat and I will unmute you. So if you have any questions for us. And if you don't have any questions, I just thank you for joining us today. And I hope we do have somebody in the chat. So let's look and see before yes, I will make the slides available. I will be sending them out to you. And just thank you for taking the time. And it's like, I think you can see, Cindy and I thought this was a great experience. And we would just encourage anybody else who wants to take this experience and run with it. So, and thank you, Cindy, for joining today.
You're welcome. Thank you for inviting me.